Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Washington, D.C. update on federal government policy and developments, where the Franklin Partnership and the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell update you on all things going on in Washington, both legislatively and in regulations. I'm Paul Nathanson. I'm here representing PRG by myself today. Caitlin's traveling, but we have our friends from the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik with us as always. And today on the webinar, we are going to discuss briefly what's happening with the tax package in Congress and then give a regulatory update. Lots happening on regulations. It's a busy time of year for regulations as the Biden administration tries to pump out as many regulations as possible to avoid the Congressional Review Act, which we can describe later. Then we'll talk about some government funding and incentives, and then lots to report on trade. The 301, which is the tariffs on China. There were some major announcements in the past couple of weeks regarding those and on the exclusion process. So I'm going to turn it over to John to start us off. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Paul. And everybody, if you have a question throughout this webinar, feel free to write a question in the lower right-hand corner. We'll try to answer them throughout the presentation here. So we're often asked, what is the status, as Paul said, what is the status of that tax bill that overwhelmingly passed the House that included the important provisions like the R&D tax credit, bonus depreciation 163J. We are hoping that the Senate, it's stuck in the Senate right now. We were hoping the Senate would vote on it before they left for the Memorial Day recess. They did not cast that vote. There's still a slim chance of hope that the Senate may take it up in June prior to leaving for the July 4th recess, because as we've mentioned in the past, nothing happens in Congress without a deadline. So with that July 4th deadline out there, that is another deadline that, it's going to depend on how many Republican senators are going to go along with moving that legislation.
John, I think that's right there. John, I think that's exactly right. I had a call with Schumer staff last week, and they said unless there's a sea change in Republicans, they just don't see them putting it on the floor for a vote in the Senate. So I think, John, you're right. It still does hinge on Republicans publicly coming out in support of the tax bill that Davenport wrote.
And that's why we're starting to see thoughts and discussions and actions moving beyond this current tax bill and looking at 2020, what's going to happen in 2025 as many of the tax provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are set to expire. As we mentioned at last month's webinar, the House Leadership, House Ways and Means Committee established 10 tax teams that would talk about the various provisions of the tax code and how they would be treated under a new tax bill that would take place in 2025. And then in the past month, we saw the Senate put together some working groups to do similar things. And so we fully expect R&D bonus depreciation 163J to be included in anything that moves next year, but we're still hopeful and optimistic that Senator Schumer could see the light and put this bill up, because I think if they put the bill up, once they pass the filibuster, I think this will pass with strong bipartisan support, but it's getting to that 60 vote margin to overcome the filibuster. So that's what's holding that up. But just because Congress isn't passing a tax bill doesn't mean nothing's going on. The Ways and Means Committee, as we mentioned last month, it's established those tax teams. They've created a portal so that individuals, businesses, and associations can submit their comments of their recommendations for renewal of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act next year. The House Appropriations Committee, subcommittees are continuing to do their work. Education and Labor is going to be considered in June 27th, DOD in June 5th. Before they left for the Memorial Day recess, the Congress passed the National Defense Authorization, and the House passed a supply chain resiliency bill with an overwhelming 390 some votes. So there is still a lot going on in Washington. As we've mentioned in the past, with the appropriations, we have a lot of cabinet secretaries and administrators trooping up to Capitol Hill to testify, trying to get the most bang for their buck to increase their budget lines, and so that's what is taking up most of the effort there. There was an effort, and as we've talked in the past, Congress often is likely going to come back in a lame duck session, but they often punt appropriations bills to the next quarter. And we're starting to hear discussions specifically by some conservative Republicans who are suggesting that to the speaker that, hey, depending on what happens in the election, let's punt the appropriations to the next Congress, where if there is a Republican in the White House and Senate and House, that they'll have more leverage. Well, Speaker Johnson has says we've got enough on our plate for next year, and that he's right now not in favor of punting appropriations bills to the first quarter of next year. And there, I would agree with them.
John, we got one question here on R&D. We might as well just go ahead and answer it since it's on topic. We just completed it. The question was, if R&D and bonus depreciation get voted through by the Senate, will it be retroactive or only go forward for 2024 and so on? We were able to secure language making it retroactive. So the language that passed the House with 84% of the vote does make it retroactive to January 1 of 2022 for R&D full expensing, eliminating the requirement for amortization and capitalization and paying taxes on your R&D activities. The bonus depreciation is retroactive to January 1 of 2023. The process by which they would make you whole on R&D is still being discussed, in large part deferential to how the IRS would put out guidance on it. Their thinking would be over a 2-year period over your next 2-year returns that you file. That's how you would be made whole, and the retroactivity. So that's a good question. If and when they do pass it, we did secure it to be retroactive there. And as John was starting to mention, a lot of stuff, and to Paul's point as well, on the regulatory side, there's quite a few that we're going to run through here, especially now that we're going into the summer months. And we know that OSHA activity is certainly slated to increase. We have seen this now in the previous 2 years in some iteration from federal OSHA, a Beat the Heat campaign. In the last couple of years, it was awareness. And now they're shifting more into engaging with employers a little bit more directly. This is a deconstructed one-pager. If you actually take it, it's a poster that you can put out in the shops, and it's pretty easy to obviously to run through. But the idea is that they want to now look at best practices from different companies and different associations and organizations of what they've been able to do with regards to addressing heat in the workplace. And this year is not intended to tell you all to go out and start taking pictures and sending it in, but rather to show that this is certainly an emphasis. And this even dates back to them starting here about a month ago as we're going now into the Memorial Day. 2 items that the Centers for Disease Control put out here in the last couple of weeks as well, and it's a change on what they did last year. They started this process, but again, they've been both agencies, OSHA and CDC, are building upon with regards to heat. And also, I should mention HHS, Health and Human Services in particular, is part of this group that's been working on over the federal government. The CDC is now looking at heat prevention and also forecasting. In one ways, they want to take a look at your dashboard, and if you want to, I think they envision, they haven't said this, but based on conversations with OSHA, is they envision the folks that are running the shift, the supervisors, to in your pre-shift meetings, go and check this, look at the heat risk for the day, incorporate it as part of conversations with employees if they are looking at an 80-degree or an 87-degree increase. And you can go down and look at the future casting as well. And that part of it is here, and you look at the heat risk forecast tool. This, if the final rule does go forward on heat later on this year or next, this is one of those tools that we believe the federal government would want you to use to help predict your shift schedules. For example, during conversations on this OSHA indoor-outdoor heat rule, they've talked about maybe changing your schedules to begin the shift starting at 5 and concluding at 2 p.m. instead of having them work during the hottest part of the day. And that's something that's certainly being considered that's out there as well. When we take a look at where we are right now in the process on heat, was on a couple of calls recently, and one where OSHA themselves was on 2 Fridays ago, speaking about the indoor and outdoor heat rule. As a reminder, last fall in September, OSHA put out a proposed outline for how they would look to regulate indoor and outdoor workspaces when that heat index reaches or exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit, including mandating a certain amount of breaks every so often, amount of water, and also weather acclimatization, and a number of other different requirements that they would put on employers. As of that point last year, it was still a one-size-fits-all, whether you're working in a kitchen or you're outdoors in construction or indoors in manufacturing. And that was part of the arguments that we made as one voice against it. Here's the latest timing that we believe, based on comments that Douglas Parker, the Assistant Secretary for Labor who runs OSHA, stated to us the other day, is that they were completing outreach to the final group of stakeholders in May and expected that to have been completed by the time that we're speaking right now. The next step is for OSHA to send it over to the White House for review as part of what we call the regulatory process that OIRA has to go through, after which it would be released to go out public in a proposed format. We believe that it'll come out likely by Labor Day. In the interim, we do know that OSHA is certainly moving forward with this national emphasis program on heat and instructing inspectors to take a particular focus on this space. And we encourage you to visit those OSHA websites and the previous links to get a better understanding of what tools, posters, and also requirements under the national emphasis program from April 8th of 2022 that you need to be working on there as well. A few other things from the Department of Labor and OSHA. This is the HAZCOM rule that has been long awaited and come out. This is largely geared towards the chemical manufacturing and handling industries, but the rule also goes further, and as you see down at the below, all employers with hazardous chemicals in their workplaces must have labels and safety data sheets for their exposed workers and train them to handle the chemicals appropriately. It is this second bullet point that will likely affect most of our manufacturing members, and as this rule gets phased in and improves its compliance, it's intended to comply with the global chemical hazard rule, and that's why OSHA took so long to come up with this and get there. Here are the major changes to look at: hazard classifications for physical hazards, as well as for classifications of certain mixtures. Labeling, that's where we would probably look more towards our members, because the data sheet that's provided by that chemical manufacturer must then be incorporated and available in your shops as well, along with information and training. So it's those final 2 points that we'd suggest that as this rule gets rolled out, if you do have any of the hazardous chemicals, which most of you will, that are identified here, there may be additional data sheets that you receive from your suppliers. Please make sure when they come in, those are not pro forma. Those are likely going to be updated to reflect the requirements under this new rule. Speaking of, one more OSHA slide here. Worker walk around, wanted to give you an update. And as of 2 hours ago, when I checked, although Texas is a little behind us, we have not seen a court rule on the requested injunction. We've been part of a number of groups. The Chamber of Commerce is leading an effort in a lawsuit against OSHA on their third-party walk-around rule that would allow them to bring in a third party to accompany OSHA inspector on those walk-arounds. That lawsuit was filed. The rule takes effect today, with the idea being, moving forward, that you could have anybody that might be a union rep, even if you're not union shop, a trial attorney, you could have environmental activists coming into your shops, and that rule takes effect today. On that same call with Doug Parker a few weeks ago, he said they'd already conducted a webinar to train their OSHA inspectors on how to deal with third-party requests if an individual is in fact listed on the warrant and shows up at your shop and says your employee or employees designated me as a representative. You must obviously let them in with certain guidelines and requirements. So note that we are hopefully expecting some kind of injunctive relief from that court in Texas down in Waco, and hopefully we can see that by the end of today. A warning here just for some of you folks that have 100 or more employees with regard to your EEO1 data. We mention this every few months or so. This is with a lawsuit that was filed against 15 employers, including 2 manufacturers and an auto dealer, among other industries that had failed to file their EEO1 reports in just 21 and 2022. So that shows you that the EEOC is looking closely at those stages as well. Last week this week, a couple days ago, I was in Kansas City speaking to the NTMA chapter there, and someone asked me about CMMC and cybersecurity, and I mentioned to him that the Department of Defense had just now released a few days ago their defense industrial base cybersecurity strategy to make sure that the resiliency of the defense industrial base, the DIB, remains solid. And you do notice that they are increasingly focusing here on downstreams, and that's been part of our lobbying campaign and making sure that DoD understands that these allowable costs are not often being accepted by the primes and the subcontractors, and these costs are $100,000 to $300,000 for compliance, for cyber, for CMMC, and other government requirements that are there. And you can take a look at this framework, but here's how they're looking at doing it and moving forward with their mission of supporting the DIB and looking at the cybersecurity and moving it down to the resiliency of cyber contested environments and the corroborations. And so we should expect here in the coming months some additional outreach from the Department of Defense, and we will also initiate that on your behalf as well. But please note that this is certainly a priority for DoD, for you defense contractors that are out there. Speaking of foreign, issues. One that's been long awaited, and this came out the day we were doing our previous webinar on May 3rd, but the Department of Energy and the IRS have released their definitions under the electric vehicle tax credits, under the batteries, and for the overall EVs. And as part of that, they had to come up with what is a foreign entity of concern that would not make that product eligible, or that final product eligible for a tax credit or incentive. And that foreign entity of concern has been there. Now they're talking about if you have that foreign entity of concern, if it's headquartered, incorporated, or if performing relevant activities in one of those covered nations, meaning China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea, then you're not permitted. If 25% or more of your voting rights, board seats, et cetera, up there. So as you can see, as part of 30D, that's the clean vehicle technology, or tax credit rather, and the EV battery components that are manufactured, they would be ineligible to receive the tax credits starting this year. And that was obviously after Sherrod Brown on the Hill and a lot of Republicans and Hawley and others really went after the administration for the initial language and how that was written. It could have been interpreted to be a bit loose towards China. Voluntary credit markets. This was an announcement. Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, started speaking about this the last week or early this week. And from that standpoint, where she's putting out on the voluntary carbon markets, this has been around for a little bit here. And there's a lot more details. I'll put the link in the one that we send around here shortly. But there's multiple pages in this guideline of the different agencies that are working together and how they can improve working with the private sector for carbon trading credits. These are, as you think of it, in California and elsewhere and overseas, where you could have companies trading carbon credits and receiving allocations for them. They are looking at ways where they can simplify the process for businesses to further engage it, but also trying to give more direction for companies to really be focused on their own internal supply chain. And as you can see over on that third bullet, corporate buyers that use credit should prioritize measurable emissions reductions within their own value chains. And that's picking up on a number of the other priorities that the administration has had in this space in their activities there as well. Just one more item on regulations before we get into a few other topics there as well. The Commerce Department has released their workforce agenda. I know we don't normally think of the Department of Commerce as leading the way on this, but they've been doing quite a bit, obviously, in the semiconductor space and Inflation Reduction Act, and some of the infrastructure work is there. And so now they're trying to coordinate and identify the different priority workforce, agendas from across the different agencies and incorporate those into their own and act as a little bit more of a repository for those activities that are out there. So again, regional clusters, that's something that we've been talking about for a number of years and for some time with them, and we'll continue to follow up with folks over the Commerce Department that we know in that space. One thing we wanted to flag for you on this webinar are the number of government funding opportunities that have been posted recently in the month of May. Actually, most of them are rehashing the old, but they're making it and putting it in such a way that makes it a little bit easier for normal businesses to be able to digest. And we wanted to post them here for you all to be able to see what might be there. These obviously, it's a Biden administration, so are focused on climate and reducing and increasing some energy efficiency and reducing some of their emissions output. This was just released yesterday afternoon, or yesterday early mid-morning rather, and it gives you a listing here. For example, for those of you that are outside of the urban areas and in a rural area, that's where you'd want to look to the Department of Agriculture for different kind of fundings. Use up to 75% of the project cost for direct loans or loan guarantees for renewal projects in certain areas, for carbon captures, for improvements to small businesses in rural areas, maximum loan guarantees, and so on. In addition, they highlight some of the Export-Import Bank that loans of $10 to $80 million for loan guarantees for finance capital investments for exports and creating jobs, and similar additional for working capital. Now, many of our members don't typically tell us they need that, but we just want to flag it in case there are some interest or you're not finding success with your traditional lender. And this list goes on for a couple of pages, so we only put in a couple of examples from this handbook. We encourage you to have somebody take a look. We always try to tell you, you're often going to do these work anyway, so you might as well see how the government can help support and give you some of your own money back. To that effect, also listed on that list, I did want to highlight, since this happened yesterday, from the Small Business Administration, there was a loan limit in terms of the number of loans that you could take and qualify for energy projects, or for 504s in general. And so now under the Section 504 loan program, they have removed the cap on lending for clean energy projects as part of their broader efforts on clean energy. So these are loans that are up to $5.5 million that you could be able to secure. You can secure as many of the 504s as you want. If it's going towards a policy for energy rather project that's going to reduce your energy consumptions, your retrofits, you're adding solar, and that's something to also think about if you're going to get better T&Cs from them than you might from your traditional lender that's out there. Another area, and I'll give a shout out to our colleagues over at Motor Equipment Manufacturers Association at MEMA, who had worked on this starting in October. We were on a few calls with them going into December into the White House, and they really took the lead and did a great job in getting the White House to move around some money and to highlight some of the opportunities that are available specifically for automotive suppliers. And so Ann and her team did a good job over there, and we worked initially back with her on giving her some thoughts on where our members might be on this. The White House did announce on May 6th, there's about split over, there's a $50 million program here for automotive conversion grants. And then they've got a couple other programs, one of 25 million, and that will help in their minds moving people over from ICEs over onto the EV space to ensure that there's a supply chain that isn't straddled with just having to foot the bill entirely on their own. Similar, looking at the SBA side and the SBIC money that's already been out there, similar on the 7A lending program to provide lines of credit to small businesses, including auto parts manufacturers. So this would make that an additional priority for those industries that are over there, and that's something to keep taking a look. And then lastly on this one, the White House did announce on May 6th that they are looking at launching an auto suppliers transition network with the intention to help provide technical assistance in those communities with heavy automotive for small and medium-sized businesses to look at opportunities, but also to ultimately work as regional hubs for technical, financial, industry, and other workforce needs to support those individual suppliers. And so they've heard that message that the EV transition, you all recall we did a survey of you, many of you in September, and sent that over to the White House about some of the tooling transition in particular. And this is a result of some of those efforts and others as well. Jumping over to trade, and then we'll get ready to wrap up and take some questions, but the trade section is going to be a bit bulky. We did have a big announcement, long awaited, long overdue announcement from the Biden administration on their Section 301 China tariffs. By law, following former President Trump's imposition of the Section 301 tariffs starting in July 8th of 2018, after 4 years, the law requires the government to conduct what they call a 4-year review to determine the impact on the U.S. economy of that tariff action and whether or not they've had an impact there or not. Just a reminder, we do still have a 25% tariff on 6,800 imports from China, 7.5% on 3,200. The Biden action of the previous week, 2 weeks ago, effectively increased the tariff rate on a select number of goods, and we'll go through those numbers that are there as well, including taking electric vehicles, quadrupling them to 100%, and steel and tripling some steel tariffs to 7.5%, from 7.5% to 25%, and then also restarted an exclusion process that was there and hadn't been moving, had been closed for some time. USTR, as part of completing that 4-year 301 tariff review, did identify 2 areas, saying that the Section 301 action, the tariffs on China, have been effective, encouraging China to take steps towards eliminating some of the reasons that Trump put on the tariffs in the first place, such as transfer-related, IP theft, and some of those other areas. However, in the very next bullet, it says China has not eliminated many of its technology transfer-related policies, practices. So the Biden administration tried to have it both ways, being able to say that the tariffs are working, so that's why we're keeping them, but the tariffs haven't changed the action, so that's why we're going to do more. And here's the more that they've identified. This is our condensing it. If you click on the link, it'll go into the exact details by HTS number as you get into several hundred of these that are receiving an increase in tariff, but they all fall into really one of 3 buckets, with one exception of face masks. The rest and syringes, they typically will all go into the bucket of EV or renewable in some form, or going into steel and aluminum products, which takes up a number of the HTS codes. So as you'll see, they're phased in over certain times, starting on August 1st of this year. Anything you see here listed that says 2024 will receive a tariff rate increase, in most cases up to 25%. And then any increases later to take effect on January in 2025 or 2026 will occur on January 1st of that year. Semiconductors will go up to 50% next year, for example, and you'll look at a slate of steel and aluminum products that are going up on August 1st, and you can look at those in more detail. The other item that the administration did here in their actions on May 14th was to propose exclusions for certain solar manufacturing equipment. A reminder, an exclusion is a process by which an importer may request to not pay the tariff of 25 or 7.5% or now 50 or 100% in some cases on imported products. What this allows you to do is petition the U.S. Trade Representative to say, I cannot find this product in the U.S. or a third-party country, and therefore I should not pay the tariff on the 25% or 7.5%. That's where to be limited to. And if that's the case, they grant it or they deny it. What they're automatically doing is for certain products related to the solar industry, and this goes on for about 2.5 pages or so, they do list a number of goods, about 1.5 pages. They list all the goods that are automatically going to receive an exclusion, but this is open for comment. What that means is any of these products listed here would be eligible to come into the United States without a tariff for a certain time frame going up to May 31st of 2025. The next two slides are a similar form. These are not automatic exclusions. However, these are the ones that they are making eligible for exclusions. This would take a process by which you would have to, again, petition to lift the tariffs to come in. You also would have a process by which you could object potentially to somebody making this request. And that's what we're looking at through this process that was announced yesterday. As you can see, you might be on one of two sides of this. A company might be on both sides. You might be importing a machine from China that you're using to manufacture a tool, for example, that's competing with that import from China. And that's where each company is going to need to take a look at this list if they are bringing anything in from China or competing with China to that effect. As you can see, there's casting machines, there's forming machines, CNC press brakes, servo presses, non-numerical presses that are in here, hydro presses. They've got lathes, turning machines. There's a lot that's in here. Grinders as well are also appear on this list. Casting machines, forging machines, many others. They all appear under chapters 84 or 85. Those are all the exclusions that they're allowing. 312 items that appear under the machinery, manufacturing, or equipment area, and that was where the president's team at the USTR limited it to. And this is the other area for some of our folks to take a look at some of the tooling, for example, that's been now listed as eligible. This does not mean that they will be granted an exclusion automatically. This means that they are eligible for being petitioned to request an exclusion from paying those 25% tariffs. These here are all 25% tariffs. I don't believe any are on the 7.5 list, but we could double check in case anyone needed to know. Something to take a look at, please click that link. We are also asking, please give us feedback on this. If you have a product that appears as one of these 312 items in Appendix K, please reach out to us or your NTMA or PMA contact and tell us, yes, I manufacture one of these, or yes, I import one of these from China. That would help us in identifying which areas of comment that we need to focus on here ahead of the June 28th deadline. Multiple things happened subsequent to that May 14th announcement. Sticking with China, the U.S. Trade Representative, as I mentioned, is extending some exclusions through 2025. This is now separate from what they did on the solar. There's a batch of currently 429 exclusions that were expiring today on May 31st. What USTR did is it's going to extend a batch of them through June 14th of this year and the remainder into May 31st. Most of these are COVID related. We did not identify any products that are receiving this that should have an indirect impact on any of our manufacturers, but we just wanted to flag that this is another one of the action to minimize on the already slated list of confusion I've caused with all these slides. Adding to this, as I mentioned, an exclusion process is being started. What is happening right now with the comment period, it is not on individual products, whether you should import them or not, it is whether or not they should appear on the list. This will be the next step. Once USTR identifies if all 312 products will remain or they'll add or remove, then they're going to issue this form, which is in this case called an Information Collection Request Form, an ICR, and these are the questions they're going to ask. When they're going to say, is the Chinese origin manufacturing equipment of concern subject to anti-dumping? Can they be used in domestic manufacturing? This is the page that's important with some of these questions. If you are competing against the product from China, is that product, is that tooling, is that machine, is it available from sources in the United States or in a third country? The USTR is asking those again, as they had beginning in November of 2019, but getting even more detailed as well. They also ask here in question 11, not listed, is this listed on the Made in China 2025 list? They've also asked that question in the past. So they're asking for justification here, and we would expect that once this form is completed, we probably think it's an August 1st timeline for these actions to largely begin. The USTR Here are some quick takeaways on the actions. As I mentioned, the increased tariff rates will take effect on August 1st, those that are scheduled for 2024. Anything that's going into effect in 25 or 6 will be on January 1st. And then we look at the exclusion request form with a comment due deadline of July 30th. That's the one I just showed you a moment ago. And then on the overall process and the findings of the 301 report are due in about a month on June 28th. Off of China, just a quick couple more slides. And again, encourage you to type in, as John mentioned, any questions you might have in the box on the right-hand side, either in questions or in chat. I'm happy to take those and answer those here in about 2 or 3 slides or so. On the steel front, a couple of updates, and let me start with what is not on this slide. As I mentioned, there are exclusions for the Section 301 China process that USTR works through. Over on the steel and aluminum side, that exclusion process is run by the Bureau of Industry and Security over at the Commerce Department. The Commerce Department is currently working on revising its exclusion process, allowing importers of steel and aluminum from around the world to request not to pay the tariffs of those 25 and 10% coming in on steel and aluminum respectively. Paul and his group through the coalition that he works on filed comments back in October of last year asking for certain changes to that exclusion process. This is not that. What they did on May 20th was more narrow. They did indicate that we should expect to see in the next coming months an update on that steel and exclusion process moving forward. So this is not the change to the process. This is an update, as you see here, on the generally accepted exclusions, or generally approved exclusions rather. And these are ones that the government already approves. These have now been lifted. They removed 12, 6 on steel, and these 6 as well on aluminum as a precursor in moving forward with the next step that are out there as well. Moving forward, as you can always take a look at these lists, we suspect that to be a live document. They will continue to make changes to this over time. And then near lastly here, this shouldn't be a surprise since Congress did pass this into law with regard to uranium imports from China. Those of you that are supplying the nuclear industry or are being powered in certain areas of the country by it, this is likely where you will be affected. Note that they did permit import of Russian uranium if an applicant requesting a waiver can show it has no alternative viable source of uranium, and that would be done through the Secretary of State and over at the Commerce Department. Lastly, before I turn it over to Paul for a couple of slides here, the U.S. did request another rights review on labor and union organizing down in Mexico. This continues a trend following conversations out in Phoenix between the USTR, Mexico, and Canada as they move forward with the USMCA, the new NAFTA review over there. Paul, just a couple of updates I think you wanted to give us on media and elsewhere.
Yeah, we had a nice story, highlighting a member, Jeff Asnavorian, at Clips and Clamps, Paul Wiseman from AP, who has written a number of stories in manufacturing. He's the economics writer, contacted me about writing a story about the Trump and Biden trade policy and what is the differences and the similarities. And he basically concluded that the Biden trade policy is a continuation of the Trump policy. And Jeff did a nice job on talking about the impact of the 232s and the issues involving trying to develop a strategy to confront China. So I thought Jeff did a good job in talking about not choking off U.S. manufacturing through a tariff wall that doesn't provide any competition to the domestic steel industry, but also understanding that we need to confront China and their trade practices. So it's just a reminder, Jeff responded to a media volunteer outreach that I did. We'll have an NTMA member on a podcast on NPR coming up, talking about some labor issues. So just keep that in mind. We're going to record another episode of the Talking with One Voice podcast that is available wherever you find your podcast. We record one every couple of weeks, and we got one scheduled for Tuesday, which is you'll hear the same voices, but we also get a little more into politics and the campaign. I think there was some events that happened this week that might be important. That's what I'm hearing, so we might talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, he's at Trump Tower. He's at Trump Tower right now speaking. There's a lot of hand gestures.
So a few things as we wrap up. As always, thank you all for your support. to make these podcasts or these webinars here happen, and the podcast that Paul mentioned as well, and for continuing to support your national organizations, without which obviously none of this would be possible. I'm going to answer a couple of questions that come out here. For this one is also targeted, I think, to my favorite Astros fan. Here's a question. If a company were to purchase Chinese equipment subject to a tariff in the US, but is delivered to a facility in Mexico and stays there, is it excluded from the tariff? A couple things to break down here. If the product does not come into the United States at all, then no, there is no tariff. If the product goes down to Mexico and then comes into the United States with minimal or no transformation of that product, it would still be subject to the tariff, and that would be considered a transshipment. If the product undergoes substantial transformation, then it likely will have a new HTS code, have a new form, function, or purpose. Then it'll have a new HTS code, and then it would now originate in Mexico and be a product of Mexico and subject under any other duties or non-duties available, but not the China tariffs. There's now two qualifiers here. One, if the product is automotive and coming into the United States and it's made of steel, there's going to be melted and poured requirements on that under the new NAFTA, and thereby you might have to pay some NAFTA tariffs. You would likely not have to maybe pay the 25% tariff, but there are discussions on how to increase some of those efforts, especially if this has melted steel or aluminum coming in from China. The last area, and this is now a Mexico issue, we do know that due in part to pressure from the United States on this very situation of imports coming in from Mexico to the United States, that Mexico is now increasingly looking at putting tariffs on products coming in. Mexico, in response to the United States a few months ago, did impose additional tariffs on certain steel and aluminum products coming in from China in direct response to the U.S. allegations of transshipment. In addition, we are now hearing, I won't say the industry and association, but they did just reach out to one of our leaders here at One Voice and say, let's talk. We might want to think about how we can impose further tariffs on all three, U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and coming in there. So to that individual that asked the questions, if you'd like to talk about that further, please reach out to me, contact information here, or we can get you in touch with the appropriate folks. But there's still a number of hurdles and barriers prior to complete entry without having to pay a tariff. With that, we'll also then ask a related question is, what is the guess on what happens with all of this if Trump wins the election? And similar to what I've said in previous presentations, is that it won't matter to Trump why a tariff is in place. He just wants a tariff in place. And what he's looked at is across the board. Biden is part of his rationale and public focus here is saying we are being very targeted. If you go across the board like Trump is saying he is on the campaign trail, that will worsen inflation. If it's Biden, he's going to continue a targeted approach, specific HTS codes and products and industry as a priority, such as EVs and solar, and whereby if it is Trump, it's going to be more universal, probably higher rates because he's going to need to outdo what Biden did and then be more across the board, including beyond just China, or what sources indicate on that front. But regardless, we do expect tariffs to continue both on China and on steel and aluminum for the foreseeable future. With that, any other questions? I know we're running a little bit long. Happy to answer any here or any additional offline. Okay. Seeing none come through. Thank you, everybody. Our next webinar will be on the 28th, I believe, is that Friday in June at noon Eastern. Please look out. We will be switching over to a Zoom platform. So when you do get that registration, know that that link is slightly different and intentional. Thank you all. And enjoy your weekend.